All right, it's 11:10. I think we'll get started. Welcome back, everybody. Really impressed that folks are still staying with us. I know on a Saturday doing a general and then a session one and then session two is difficult, and I think it's a testament to everyone's commitment to this work. So I appreciate everybody jumping into this second session. This is a session between oppression and liberation using data for action and impact. My name's Tim. I work for the County of Sacramento, but on this and focus on economic justice using kind of a racial equity and criminal legal framework to inform my work. But today I'm wearing more of a community hat, and also in the voice of an organization I work with called the Justice to Jobs Coalition, which focuses on criminal legal, local criminal legal reform efforts. And again, just want to, for me, like this work is all about, the information that I'm and the relationships I have with community. And again, I'm only able to do this because I have that relationship. And it's certainly a privilege to have that as well. Janine, do you want to introduce yourself? Oh, your audio. Oh, Janine, you're muted.
Thanks, Tim. Always seems to happen. So I am Janine Spotnitz. Similar to Tim, I also work for the County of Sacramento and Health Services. Currently, I'm focused on COVID-19 response for people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, as well as alternatives to 911 for mental health response. My background is in public policy, community research, and evaluation, and I'm just speaking openly as a community member today. So to start off with, we'd love to hear from you all. So if you think about what brought you to this session, what are you hoping to learn today? We want to hear from you what you're most interested in learning about, and you'll see here the options. We have 1, the framework for research, justice, and intersectionality. 2, data-centered approaches to support carceral legal work. 3, if there's specific carceral system data you have questions about, and 4, any challenges you're hoping to strategize around. So please just add the number. You can multiple choice if there's more than one that you want to select. Just drop it in the chat. And we also welcome you to share your organization and where you're living in the chat too. It's nice to see where people are coming from. So I'm seeing a lot of 1s, 1 and 4s. How to engage data for systems change and not individual blame. Absolutely. Got some 2s as well. Some 3s and 4s, but predominantly 1. Okay, 1s and 4s. Great. So you can keep that coming, and we're going to have that in mind as we go through our presentation today. We have a lot of content, so I just want to apologize in advance. We tried to pack a lot in, and we're going to try to focus on a few things that people are most interested in, but we'll definitely share the recording and the slides afterwards if you drop your email in the chat.
And just a brief agenda. So we, Janine will be talking a little bit about the research justice frameworks and principles. I'll be doing like a quick 10-minute case study on the SB 1022, California State Bill 1022 jail expansion. And then we'll be going to future directions and questions. And we're hoping we can dedicate a good amount of time to the questions piece. And again, the frameworks and principles piece is really good. It's also a lot of images and text, but know that we'll be sharing the slides out later. But please do at some point drop your emails in the chat when instructed to do so. And so, yeah, I think we'll just get started.
Great, thank you, Tim.
Oh, you know what? Let me, wonder if I should move back to that other slide.
If you use this version, that's okay. If you just click through it, yeah. Okay. So to start with, what does using data for action and impact mean? So I want to start with currently the status quo, really unpacking what's happening. So generally, this involves some form of study, whether quantitative and or qualitative, in a process that can be extractive because it doesn't consider critical questions, including who designed it and framed its scope, who owns the data, whose interests does it serve, and who will benefit from it. And then especially, how are people directly impacted by the issues involved throughout the process, especially in shaping the agenda. So the status quo that many of you are probably familiar with in various institutions you work at or have been educated at, status quo is to conduct research and take action, including making policies and decisions without integrating meaningfully the people most impacted by those decisions. So in other words, it's not accountable to communities under the veil of being objective, neutral, and unbiased. As a result, at worst, this produces disconnected research whose inadvertent impacts may include disrespecting, misrepresenting, and even harming people who are directly impacted by the issue. So for example, this could be through framing that's individualizing the problem, as someone noted in the chat, focusing on a victim narrative, or even using terminology such as vulnerable people that is inherently individualizing. It can also be by providing disparity data. So we may think we have good intentions, we're doing a good job by pointing out disparities by race and ethnicity, but without actually noting the root cause, that is subject to misinterpretation and the individualizing. It can also be produced by narrowly framing questions, like asking what training should police have for mental health and implicit bias, rather than starting more broadly and asking, who do you want to respond to you in a mental health crisis? And I just see a comment here that didn't know using vulnerable people as individualizing. I think there's a spectrum of language, and vulnerable people isn't the most problematic, but it's preferred, I think, to use terms like marginalized people because that hints more at the structural conditions underlying those conditions of marginalization. So this approach doesn't challenge systems of power that underlie the issues we're researching and may even, as I mentioned, inadvertently reinforce inequitable dynamics. So what then is equity-centered work or anti-oppressive work? What does that look like? Well, at the foundation, as we are defining the problem, we identify structural conditions, and I'll delve into that a bit more later. But that involves being mindful of power dynamics and intersectionality, which means we must consider our own social position, role, and power. We understand knowledge isn't produced in a vacuum. We're all located within a complex set of social structures, and our identities impact the questions we ask, the methods we use, and the conclusions we draw. It also involves drawing from research justice, which is a strategic framework that seeks to achieve self-determination for marginalized communities. And it does so by centralizing community voices and leadership in an effort to facilitate genuine, lasting social change. And we'll delve into more what that looks like as well. I just want to note that when we're talking about racialized violence within the structure of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, this involves centering the experiences of Black people specifically. We also need accountability. We know that we won't always get it right. I am constantly learning, and the key thing here is to be not only open to feedback reactively, but also to proactively seek to build relationships with communities who are most impacted by decisions in order to understand our potential impacts and make adjustments as needed. Next slide. So who is familiar with this wheel, this concentric circle wheel of power and oppression? You can just drop in the chat if you've seen it before, if it's entirely new to you. Broadly, this is our framing for understanding the root causes of the problem, which are inequitable distribution of power and oppression, which is exposure to trauma based on identity. So I want to ground us in these definitions of power and oppression as articulated by Prentice Hemphill, who works with generative semantics, because I appreciate their clarity. So power is the relative ability to achieve purpose, and oppression is the, if you go back, is the organization and distribution of trauma, especially by those who have concentrated power. I just think it's important to really grapple with this for a moment, because often we talk about oppression as this theoretical concept, when actually it's an accumulation of traumatic experiences that land on people's bodies and exist in relationships across time. So oppression increases the likelihood that you will experience trauma, and it operates through those dual pathways of both concentrating the experience of trauma while also reducing the resources and access to time needed to heal and process that trauma. So I'm not going to go into too much depth about this, but just want to highlight here that the innermost rings here, this is individual social identities. So this is your social locations, including race, ethnicity, indigeneity, gender, class, sexuality, and disability. And those influence access to power, which remember is the relative ability to achieve purpose. And that idea broadly, there's much more complexity to it, but just broadly, that idea is referred to as intersectionality. And I want to give credit to critical legal race scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined that term. And it was before Kimberly conceptualized by the Black lesbian feminist collective, Combahee River Collective. So the identities we inhabit have differential access to power based on these outermost two rings, which is a context of a connected system and structures of power. So these are laws, policies, ways government operate and media that you'll see here include examples like historically from slavery and colonization to redlining, deportations, and police violence targeting people of color. So the overall takeaway of this is how we're positioned within social structures impacts our power and our exposure to concentrated trauma. And this is the foundation for being able to understand what research justice entails. So to shift this power, if you go to the next slide, we see one way in which this manifests is this inequitable distribution of power is through access to knowledge production that's seen as legitimate. So community knowledge is often ignored and invalidated, and there's a variety of forms of community knowledge. We can say includes your lived day-to-day experience. Of course, people are the experts on the conditions of their lives and the issues that they experience directly. Yet this is often discounted, discredited, invalidated. And instead, the mainstream or institutional knowledge are the facts and data produced by research professionals who are usually outside of the community. So research justice framework seeks to shift this power differential and uplift lived experiences of people most directly impacted by issues. The next slide, please. Research justice, and this is as articulated by Data Center, an organization that no longer exists that I used to work for. Research justice is achieved when marginalized communities are recognized as experts and reclaim and own all forms of knowledge and information. So with strategic support, the information generated by these communities can be used as political leverage to advance their own agendas for change. And I know there's a lot on this slide, but I want to just focus on the two boxes in the center, the community right to be heard, which involves supporting the capacity and resources for community to package and produce their own information and knowledge to decision makers. And next to that, to the right of that, community right to know, which is having equal access to information that's produced outside of community members, produced in institutions, and is often inaccessible for a variety of reasons, whether it's jargony or specialized or in very large PDF documents. What's needed is to transform it through fact sheets and data visualization and translation to be able to convey to people who are most impacted. Next slide. So what gets in the way of the process of research justice, and what does it look like to support communities' right to be heard? Well, the first thing it's important to work through the insidious forms of how racism and white supremacy operate. So as illustrated in this quote here, I'll give you all a moment to read it. So it isn't only literally speaking over people, but also insidiously being trained, so as white people, through forms of community engagement, really that are tokenistic, which you'll see in the ladder to the right, and I'll explain more in a minute, approaches that can be paternalistic and don't deeply respect and uplift the expertise of lived experience. So to counteract this, I would recommend reading and regularly revisiting Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture by Tema Okun. You can Google it. It's like a 5-page piece that's free online. And that helps to shift this power dynamic and undo the way that white supremacy culture can operate in our lives. And then to be able to, yes, to respond to the question, please drop your email in the chat and you'll be able to, we'll send out the slides when they're released. So to be able to work through here, this ladder of community engagement, this is how we conceptualize using data for action from oppression at the bottom to liberation at the top. And so you'll see there the various stages of community engagement from the bottom, which is non-engagement, non-participation, to forms of tokenistic engagement that may solicit input, but without actually giving people access to decision-making power. Next slide, please. This spectrum I find really helpful for understanding that ladder in more detail. It provides each of the stages here, from ignoring to informing, consulting, involving, and then actively collaborating and deferring to. And we can send this out so people can spend more time really understanding this, but just want to acknowledge that usually what we see from institutions as far as community engagement, I would say ranges from 0 to 2, to tokenize and being asked to give input without actually having a seat at the table and being integrated in the planning process and design of policies and decisions that impact people's lives directly. Next slide. So then the third component here for what we are conceptualizing as needed for equity-centered research. Remember, we talked through recognizing intersectionality and our position within structures of power, and then about research justice and how to center people most impacted by issues in the research and decision-making processes. Well, accountability is sort of the glue that's needed for all of that to work. And essentially, this is something that is actually really under discussed and under theorized, I think, even in relationship to research justice. And here I've included some questions from people who are at the forefront of thinking about accountability in relationship to transformative or restorative justice. So these questions are from Mia Mingus of the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, and would like to encourage us to think about this in relationship to our work. So who are we accountable to? Obviously, our bosses, elected officials, people in the chain of command in which we work, but thinking outside of our organization, within communities, who are we accountable to and how? What does that look like? And really, it often requires relationships in order to have the open street for feedback, to be able to hear from people how, so reactively, reactive accountability, how our work has impacted them, and then take accountability for those impacts, but also proactively, so to build relationships, to be able to share ideas and gather input before decisions are made and policies are implemented, to assess its potential impact and make adjustments as needed. And then with that was the introduction of our framing that we're going to ground ourselves in. And now I will pass it off to Tim, who will apply this to a case study around the jail construction projects in Sacramento County.
Thanks, Janine. I want to just start off, and as Janine and I were kind of cobbling these slides together, there's this deeply moving quote that she had, And I do, and I'm going to read it. It's this, it's by an organizer and educator who many folks may know, Miriam Kaba. And she said, she has this quote here, right? Ella Baker's question, who are your people? When she would meet you is so important. Who are you accountable to in this world? Because that will tell me a lot about who you are and how much hubris we must have to think that us individual persons are going to have all the answers for generations worth of harm built on multi-millions of people. It's like, I'm on a 500-year clock right now. I'm right here knowing that we've got a hell of a long time before we're going to see the end. Right now, all we're doing is building the conditions that will allow the thing to happen. And I found that just to be a deeply moving quote. It wasn't even in my original presentation, but I want to lift that up here because, when I talk about this, this battle that the community was having over this jail expansion project in Sacramento County, it reminds me of just the little nugget of information that's going to come out of this, right? And that it really is this battle against decades and centuries of oppression, right? And so I want to speak, the case study I'm going to lift up here is about a jail expansion. And I think part of it is just reminding ourselves that when we think about public health as, or racism as a public health issue, it's also just reminding us that jails are really this kind of monument to racism in some ways. They are deeply anti-Black in its institution. It's both its institutional format and just so many authors and readings can speak to this. And I think for the Sacramento context, we're about 11% African American in the county, but the jail population is 37% Black, right? That discrepancy, I wish it was just limited to a few jurisdictions, but we know that that's probably more significant and even more and even a greater X in other counties in California as well as outside of California. So I think that's just kind of the framing that I wanted to start off with. Is that's kind of the situation, and I think the community really felt that that any jail expansion was a bad one, and really it was being framed as an $89 million jail expansion grant. That's how some of the decision makers were framing it as, whereas the community was really trying to think about really that 500-year timeline that we just kind of discussed. They weren't thinking about it in terms of that long of a frame, but it is deeply important to think about. This is never just you don't just build it and it's done. It has much more far-reaching impacts. And real quick, there's two pictures here, and in some ways it tells a story of where the community sits, but versus where the decision makers and elected officials might have sat. On the one hand, on the left side is the same picture. It's RCCC. It's one of two jails in Sacramento, and it houses mostly our sentence population. And in that jail, it's definitely in some rural areas. Is a picture taken by the Marshall Project that shows a very sort of bleak outlook, right? As we would imagine it to be. On the bottom right is another picture, right? It's by the design and build firm Nocta Lewis, which has been really involved in a lot of jail expansion projects, both not only in Sacramento, but across the state. And it really illustrates kind of the detachment, if you will, of the feeling that you get when you look at these two images couldn't be more different. But again, I think it speaks to kind of the space that community had to occupy in order to really bring the decision makers to an outcome that they saw as promoting public health and one that was a wise investment. Slides here. So I'll speak a little bit about kind of the and I'm gonna be very oversimplistic here. I think part of it is just there isn't enough time, but I will kind of try my best, and I definitely want to get to the questions, right? So the first part is just kind of what information did the community have? Really, the case study here is about the ways in which the community was able to generate one piece of information out of lots of other information to persuade the decision makers. So what information did the community have? What information do they want? And who do they want to, and how do they want to inform? So we know that there was Overall, the data was clunky, buried inside these 100-page PDF files, some of which were dirty PDFs, so you couldn't even search them. There's a kind of not, if people have explored county board agenda search databases, they're not the most sophisticated either. And they're often hidden, not hidden per se, but there's just mounds and mounds of attachments. And so there was, in terms of what information the community had at that point, there was some information that we had from other ongoing anti-jail campaigns that the community had, both in Los Angeles and San Francisco. There were county board letters and resolutions and all the associated attachments. There was some county data, there was state jail data, which showed the population of the people on the inside. But again, there was a 6-month delay. So again, it's not as relevant as folks would have wanted to make it. And then finally, there were these, there's court documents. Sacramento County was at that time being sued by the Prison Law Office and Disability Rights Center and another law firm due to the human rights conditions in the jails. And so there was lots of attachments, a lot of data on that too. But at the same time, that created an information overload, right? The idea of serving this up on a Google Doc folder somewhere and saying, here community, like check this stuff out, isn't stuff that we knew that, at least the community knew that this wouldn't, it was not an effective kind of way to persuade. And again, I just want to kind of highlight, and this is hopefully a question we can talk about later, but it's just the ways in which public health professionals could be of service in this space. And I'll go back to kind of Janine's presentation. There was one triangle mentioned in there, which is beautifully illustrates sort of what is the knowledge that the board of supervisors and really the decision makers seek, and then what is the information that the community seeks. And again, part of it is recognizing that ultimately the decision makers are the board of supervisors. So how do you straddle that line between more corporate knowledge, if you will, right? Capitalist corporate kind of knowledge and working in those spaces and working on those, on that battlefront, right? To make it as a financial argument, but also thinking about what are its long-term health and human impacts and mental health impacts not only on the person on the inside, but we know that consistently there's research that has indicated that families are impacted, communities are impacted, and the whole neighborhoods are impacted. And so I think that's always a struggle that communities and really the broader campaign will always have. And I just want to remind folks that this knowledge really is situated within a much broader organizing strategy, which hopefully you might have been able to hear more about in the previous session. But that there was a significant mobilization, and this was just trying to contribute to one piece of information. So we talked about what data did we have, and now we're going to go to kind of what data did we want? What data did the community want? Well, this was a relatively straightforward exercise, but again, just to give you a sense of the difference between how this information lives. On the left-hand side is a document that community found, right? It's a 30-year timeline of the jail expense. And it really is it's a screenshot of an Excel document that I think was dumped into this report, into this county report, looking at the life cycle costs of the jail. But what community was able to do, and quite effectively, I think, and they were able to not only augment this during the Board of Supervisors meeting, which I think folks have, if you've ever sat in one of these are 5, 6, 7-hour meetings that are usually the people present are the county government employees, right? They're also being paid to sit there. And I juxtapose this against a lot of volunteer and community members who often have working jobs, full-time jobs, and who would take the day off to sit in these meetings. And what's notable is that beyond just getting the 2 minutes that they would normally get, or 2 or 3 minutes during the kind of formal comment period, is that some of the organizers, and I believe it's Decarcerate Sacramento, and a number of other organizations were able to carve out like a presentation time to present this slide. So even that little, that format change is notable in and of itself. But what they were able to articulate is essentially like in visually is like, here's a 30-year cost. It's not an $89 million grant as promoted by some county officials, but rather occupies a $500 million jail cost over a 30-year period. And that's taking into consideration like staffing costs, mechanical costs, electrical, plumbing, and then to top it all off, a $76 million cost just in a financing cost. And a small thing there is like they didn't have the information, but they were able to just use like the best approaches. And I think this is where, for folks who are familiar with impact assessments, which are looking at, take sort of public health approaches and apply public health approaches to look at prospectively what the impacts are going to be. They were drawing heavily from that. So I that was a really important kind of note. And then finally, just the piece on when I highlighted this earlier, right? This data really needs to sit within a broader organizing context. That this data nugget, this $500 million jail expansion price tag, really was sitting within a personal narratives and collective action and ongoing community town halls and broader coalition building that was happening within organizations. And ultimately that the data is exactly what this image represents. Community organizing is the momentum, is the wave, it's the base, it's the foundation, with data occupying just a small piece of that. And again, just want to highlight, just at least for public health practitioners who are more focused on the data side, that we need to always situate our work within that context in order for it to be effective. And again, the outcome was a favorable one, but I will say that while the RCCC jail expansion has been sort of nixed at this moment, there is an ongoing battle in Sacramento, in the Sacramento County Jail, to expand the main jail. And I saw some folks from Fresno and from a few other jurisdictions in the county. And I bet throughout the country, there is still an ongoing concerted effort to expand the jail system, the carceral system. And I think it is really important for public health folks to engage in that, right? Not just thinking about sort of diabetes and tobacco cessation, which I think are all pivotal sort of crowning sort of foundational works of public health more broadly, but to start engaging in these spaces, because this is really where public health happens as well. So want to just, and I'll pass it on to Janine at this point.
Thank you, Tim. So what lies ahead? For future directions, we wanted to spend a few moments to just share some of what we see emerging across California, which builds off of similar initiatives and work across the country. So to start with here, we have alternatives to 911 for mental health. And if you all are familiar, this here is the sequential intercept model, which shows all of the intercepts or points of involvement with the criminal legal system that could be opportunities for diversion to other systems. So an alternative crisis line response is the earliest diversion possible here at intercept 0 for community services, to have an alternative line that people experiencing mental health crises can call to get a response from community, peer, clinician. There's different models for the staff composition there, but essentially that would be diversion from police response and criminal legal system involvement at the earliest point there. And as far as the data on how many people this would impact, so we don't have great data on this, but national studies estimate that about 44% of people who are incarcerated have a mental health disorder. And so we see jail becoming a de facto mental health service provider, which we know is, those of you who attended some other sessions around how the challenges of actually delivering behavioral services within the conditions of the jail and how those actually really cannot be done well. So the process of exploring this alternative system, there's many challenges involved, right? So that includes buy-in and funding and community design. But for the purposes of our conversation today, given our focus on data, I want to focus on that aspect of data and community engagement in the process. So there's very limited data on 911 calls that have the nexus with mental health issues. And part of the reason for that is, one, that law enforcement agencies can voluntarily decide whether or not they want to publish their 911 call data. So if you look it up, or we can share links to how to find that data, you can see if your local jurisdictions are sharing that data or not. So first question, are they even sharing the data? Second question, if they are sharing the data, what is the quality of the data? And we know that the coding for mental health issues that's shown in the data is at the onset. So when someone calls initially, if it's clear there's a mental health issue, then that would be coded. But the majority of the time, that doesn't actually surface until you're in person or engaging, or someone really with expertise of being a mental health clinician can be able to determine that. But there isn't a system that I've seen in the data that I've analyzed that involves going on the back end to recode the data to accurately capture all the calls that are mental health related. So in the absence of that, we have, and I see a question here, where in the model does mental health court fit in? That would be an Intercept 3 under jails and courts. That could be a specialty court. So in the absence of good data, and to engage community, what is being done is holding listening sessions with community. So casting the broadest possible net, providing the option of translation, interpretation for all the 7 threshold languages that we have, to hear from community members, what do you want to see in a crisis response for mental health issues? So what is the team composition that you would like to be there? What kind of skills do you think are really important for that team to have? How would you like to access this? Is it through 911 or through a separate call line? So really getting to hear directly from community what they want to see in that, and then also including a piece around the follow-up to the crisis. What kind of follow-up would they like to see and engagement, whether that be around connecting to more ongoing services, developing a safety plan, that sort of thing. So we are at the early phases in this process, but just wanted to share that and would love to continue the conversation and learn from other folks working in health around what you're also doing on this issue and how we can support each other and strategize. Pass it to you, Tim.
Thanks, Janine. And I'll be really quick here. I wanted to highlight again, and this is probably the advocacy kind of call out, right? Which is that, when we think about jails, they're very, again, this kind of perceived as kind of this monument to racism. And at the same time, it's something very physical, right? I just did a quick Google search on images and you type in jails and this is what you get. You do a search on pretrial risk assessment and this is what you get on Google Images, right? It's just, there's no physical manifestation of it. And I highlight this because there is this emergence of, when we think about jails and why they're needed, there's this constant argument that, there's always a, there's always a place for them, right? Like, and there's always a public health, always a public safety risk. And so there's an emergence of these pretrial risk assessment tools, which I think are statewide in Kentucky, and in California, there's a really vital ballot measure right now, Prop 25, which is going to kind of decide what the future stake of this tool is. And then in New Jersey as well, and a number of other places. The connection with this work, of course, is that these pretrial risk assessments, which help determine the public safety or flight risk of a person, will determine whether or not that person sits inside jail or is let free. And this is particularly important because statewide and really nationwide, 60% of our incarcerated population is on pretrial detention, meaning they have not been accused, meaning they have not been sentenced at that point. And so it's a major feeder into, and really the major rationale for justifying these the building of these jails. And I highlight this slide entitled "The New Jim Code." Right, this is the title of Ruha Benjamin's most recent book, and she does just amazing work. But she has this haunting quote, which is that there's this employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequities, but that are promoted and perceived as more objective or progressive than the discriminatory systems of a previous era. And I feel like public health is so well positioned to take their gaze, and some of them are already doing it, right, and put it on these new and emerging technologies, right? I think it's part of our training to look at this work critically. And again, just to make this tie in, which is that the emergence of these risk assessments, which are being deployed and really are a primary mediator of the jail population, and thus then mediate the rationale for these jails, is really thinking about kind of this concept of like this kind of bias in, bias out, right? When we think about Michelle Alexander's critical work with the new Jim Crow and the rise of mass incarceration, Ruha Benjamin sort of using that, you could reframe it as like, it's basically a new form of Jim Crow, but using different tools. And again, I just want to give a credit to a few organizations: Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, Critical Resistance, AI Now out of NYU, Dignity and Power Now of Los Angeles, Silicon Valley Debug. All of these organizations are doing incredible work, and they're all primarily community-based organizations to uplift and really critique these tools, which really are gonna that can really effectively turn the spigot on of Black and Brown and low-income communities on as at the pleasure of specific criminal legal actors. And then I want to just highlight this last piece, and again highlighting that it's not just public health, but that it really has to sit within working with engaged communities, and that the more engaged communities are, the more informed and empowered they are on these types of tools. And that while we can focus on existing jail expansion campaigns, which have a very physical infrastructure, we can think about and say, we don't want this anymore. It's a lot more difficult to say, we don't want this policy or process. Okay. And just this last slide, which is just, again, just talking about future directions. There's great work out of LA. There's an organization called Free Radicals and Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Again, you can look at this stuff later, but just prefacing by that there have always been these systems of the war on drugs, war on gangs, broken windows policing that all occupied a certain infrastructure and ecosystem, and that predictive policing is doing that right now in our communities. And so we just need to think about the racialized view that some of these algorithms occupy, and again, just reasserting that all data is not bad. It's really about how it's being used. And when we think about the racial disparities and how some of these systems actually exacerbate racial disparities, public health needs to kind of step up here and start focusing the critique there. So I'll end there, and maybe we can take some questions.
So we have some great questions and points from Florida, who says, I'm always worried about the idea of engaged communities equals informed, empowered communities. If these communities don't feel heard, just how empowered are they? As well as if you're involved in the design and implementation, but need white people to speak on policy levels in order to be heard, how empowered are you? And River asks, do either of you know of any examples on how to convince a local health department to take a stance against incarceration and police violence?
I'll maybe take the first question first. No, that's a great point. I mean, I think part of it is, I think about this, that's so important for there to be kind of this broader engagement. There are a lot of organizations, All of Us or None, Initiate Justice in California, that are really rooting, organizing from an impacted person's perspective, right? That they are the ones that are going to show us and be the moral compass for this work. And at the same time, like, I think that's why, when we think about a lot of this work is, it's highly technical in nature and perhaps by design, right? The idea that, we have this algorithm, that the government runs this algorithm and it's been vetted and tested, and we have these amazing training data sets on years of data, often I think is an area that's ripe for critique. And ultimately, I think that's why there's some organizations in Sacramento as well who are really trying to center impacted persons who are experiencing this firsthand, right? They're not experiencing it from the administrative side. They're experiencing it from like the fact that like their uncle couldn't get out because they scored a certain level, right? And so I think that's a really good point, which is how do we center that experience and knowledge. Jenny, do you want to take the other one on the role of public health departments and how they
Sure.
can work?
Yeah. Dr. Tamari Macon shared this resource from Human Impact Partners that's really excellent for how health departments can address police violence as a public health issue. And so it includes, just high level, their top recommendations: building partnerships with community organizers to advance solutions, and some specific ways that health departments can implement that work. Deepening health department understanding of the framing, research, and narrative on police violence and policing. And leverage health department's power and voice to help create a shared analysis and solutions around policing. And then finally, strengthen the evidence base on police violence.
Right, and some of the, I think that resource is incredible, the Human Impact Partners one. And again, there's a couple of specific examples where they lift up the medical director in San Francisco's public health department, saying that, you know, that the jail population is too big. Most recently in California, there have been, I'd say, 30,000 people released under compassionate release in the county jails due to COVID. And I know a lot of the testimonials have required this medical expertise to highlight the dangers of it. And again, I think the point is really, how do we just not make it a COVID-19 rationale, but expand that into, as people have commented, into larger domains, to saying that this is a direct threat to the health and safety of our communities when we over incarcerate and when we're holding people on for reasons that are not too clear.
That's right. We have another question from Lindell Price, who asks, do we need to demand transparency and continuous evaluation of these systems, followed by continually correcting the bias of these systems? Should we also demand that all algorithms be disclosed?
That's such a great question. And I just feel like that's kind of, you know, recently people have asked, you know, they ask community members, like, what do you need? What resources do you need? And I don't even think it's like resources. People just need transparency. That, you know, and that to me speaks to the need for, but again, it's like what the other person mentioned, like you need impacted voices as well as data scientists. You know, again, I would encourage you to look at the Free Radicals and some of these other organizations, because it really is going to require like a sort of multi-layered effort to do a real critique of this work. People are just, and if again, have impacted voices lead, and again, have public health to the extent possible, speak into that with the public health and sort of academic and sort of algorithmic evidence that suggests that these are actually harming our communities or that they're not working. But I do agree, like full transparency is absolutely what's needed.
And now I think we are about at time. Want to reiterate thanks to all of you for joining us today and for all of your work to shift structures of power and to address racism as a public health issue. And thank you, Monique Hossein, for lifting up the policy wonk does not equal white, and there are people of color in policy out there doing the work. So we invite you to email us to keep in touch and would like to see these conversations continue beyond APHA. And then finally, I will be sharing the link to rejoin the final general session. We're going to have a closing out together with the folks who kicked us off in the beginning. So that will begin in 10 minutes. You have a 10-minute break. And then the link is at the very top of the page of the apha.org/racism-summit.
And thank you everybody so much, and super inspired just by where everyone's from, and just feel free to reach out to us. We're deeply inspired just to be able to share this space with you. Thank you.
Thank you.